So basically, the world is in overshoot. If this line here is the carrying capacity of the planet, then our exponential growth has gone beyond that. And it's just a matter of time that consumption has to fall to below this line. And unfortunately, we now have a degraded carrying capacity. Global threat 5, our house of cards economic system. In 2008, George Soros, the multi-billionaire, said that this is no normal recession. This is the end of an era when the GFC struck. The GFC, the global financial crisis, was actually an early warning tremor of growing system instability. It was triggered when oil hit $147 a barrel in July 2008. And before this decade is out, oil prices will trigger other economic collapses. Another problem is that debt levels around the world are out of control. Total debt has grown exponentially over recent decades and is now far larger than the capacity to ever repay that debt. And we know from studying history that unsustainable debt triggers crashes. This graph here shows the ratio of national private debt to gross domestic product. The black line is the ratio for Australia and the red line is for the USA. We can see that when debt levels get too high, then they've triggered crashes and depressions in the 1890s, which is here, the 1930s, Great Depression, and then now look at the levels that they're at now. Just based on debt alone, we have a lot of economic problems. Basically, the global banking and financial system is a giant Ponzi scheme. If the economy shrinks, there is not enough money to pay all the existing debt back. The economic system, if you study it in detail, you find out that it has to keep growing or it goes into collapse in the same way that a Ponzi scheme does, which leads to massive debt defaults and can cause massive bank failures, which leads to a depression. The recent bank collapses that have taken place in the US, the UK, and Europe are just a small taste of what is possible. The system's inherently unstable. Without exponential growth, it goes into breakdown. And this is why the G20 nations have desperately trying to prop up their economies with their trillion-dollar stimulus packages. So basically, the scientists are warning us that there's this carrying capacity line that we shouldn't be going beyond, and that we need to be very careful about having too much growth. But the bankers, the economists, the financial elites and the governments are saying, oh, we've got to keep growth going. We need that growth, otherwise our system starts to fall apart. And this can only end in one way. Eventually, there has to be a sharp fall. Never-ending exponential growth is impossible in a finite world. Governments have only delayed the collapses with their financial rescue packages. Global threat 6, black swans, the unknown, unexpected. A recent international bestseller, a book by the name of Black Swans, has shown that history is often determined by black swan events. Now these events are highly improbable events which are unpredictable, massive impact, unexpected and underestimated, and easy to explain only after the event. So after something happens, we all say, oh, of course, we could have seen that this was going to happen, and everyone becomes an instant expert. But very few people see it coming beforehand. So for example, wars, pandemics, natural disasters, etc., that no one saw coming. So what I'm saying is, as well as these 5 global threats that we can identify and clearly see coming, there is also the unknown, unexpected events which will combine and interact with these 5 global threats. Putting it all together, our probable future. Well, basically these 6 global threats means that system failures at some point can be expected, and that our economy and way of life will falter and not be able to continue as we've experienced. There's 4 future scenarios that have been identified by David Holmgren, who's the co-founder of permaculture. in this resource use, population and pollution all growing exponentially. We in fact live in an exponential growth society. At the point we're at now, there are 4 possibilities. One is that somehow this growth continues and we have a techno-explosion. And this was the view of the future that I grew up with. When I was a child, I thought we'd all be, flying around in hover cars or maybe, taking spaceships to Mars or something like that. And this was a common view. But we're running out of time. We've basically run out of time for this view to become a reality. When you understand the significance of peak oil and these other multiple limits to growth, this techno-explosion is looking more like a techno-fantasy. A second scenario is green tech stability. And this is a very popular view of the future amongst a lot of environmentalists and the mainstream media, that if we all just put solar panels on our roofs and we drive hybrid cars, then everything will be okay. We'll be able to continue living pretty much as we have been. This also ignores the reality that these clean technologies cannot replace the energy that we will lose from a decline of oil and eventually a decline of net energy from coal production. And so what's a far more likely scenario is that we have to deal with some type of energy descent, and a deliberate power down would be the smartest way to approach this. If we approach it in a positive way, then this could be a responsible Earth stewardship approach, where we start living closer to the Earth, being more sensitive to the needs of the planet. A fourth scenario is that we keep pushing for exponential growth, and at some point we go over a cliff and we experience a total collapse. Whatever happens, I think it's very unlikely that we're just going to have a smooth decline or even a smooth sudden collapse. What's far more likely is that we'll have an erratic descent with partial collapses and partial recoveries most likely. And it's very likely that this process has already started with the GFC, and then we've had a partial recovery, but we're in for a rocky road. Important to remember, however, that energy descent does not have to mean total collapse. The future doesn't have to look like this, and there's a very good chance that it will not. That energy descent can equal an Earth stewardship approach, but it will call for major lifestyle changes, and we will need to learn to live with less. Looking more specifically at energy descent scenarios, we can identify 4 major energy descent scenarios. The first is brown tech, and that is as we go into peak oil, that increasingly we turn to coal, natural gas, tar sands, and coal seam methane gas to try to make up for the energy that we're losing from the decline in oil production. Unfortunately, if we do that, it'll have big impacts on climate change because we're releasing more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. A second alternative is green tech, that the world as a whole turns predominantly to clean technologies, which will have less of an environmental impact on the climate, but will not be able to provide as much energy as the brown tech. A third alternative is if energy declines very fast, that will be thrown into an Earth stewardship type scenario where we really need to start a bottom-up rebuild of society based on more permaculture type principles. A fourth alternative is that particularly if we pursue the brown tech and we have a lot of climate change, that we could have actually the collapse of civilization in a lot of areas around the world, and that we'll be left with pockets of civilization functioning like as lifeboats trying to preserve the best of civilization. It's actually possible to look at these as energy descent pathways with 2 main alternatives. After peak oil, one is that we return to brown tech, and that will stabilize us for a while, but as those resources run out and as climate change gets worse, we'll then go into a second collapse, which will most likely be followed by the lifeboat scenario. Alternatively, if we pursue green tech, then we'll have a smoother energy descent, where the green tech scenario is followed by the Earth Steward scenario. How can this be? No? Or if this is true, why aren't they doing something about it? Why hasn't somebody done something about this or solved this problem? The reality is that societies get set in their ways. Joseph Tainter, in his book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, stated that people will rarely acknowledge that an accustomed way of life is unsustainable, except in the face of prolonged, devastating failure. It's just human nature to get in your comfort zone and ignore the problem, hope it goes away, because it's too difficult to deal with. And all cultures tend to over-rely on their gods. Now, today our gods aren't little stone idols that we put our faith in. Our gods tend to be the god of technology, that, technology will solve all our problems for us. Or the market, the economic system will solve the problem. If prices go up, and then there'll be resource substitution and everything will be okay. Well, we're over-relying on these gods. There's no guarantee that they will be able to rescue us. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that that's not going to happen. Elites have their own reasons for not talking about any of this. Governments are afraid that they'll crash the stock market if they say much about peak oil. Some, however, are discreetly preparing for peak oil. For example, China is buying up agricultural land and energy resources around the world as we speak. But basically, most governments, they just want to win the next election. That's what their focus is on. Vote for me and everything will be okay. You can just see the election campaign speechwriters at work. Let's change brink of chaos to everything is wonderful, because that's the kind of positive message that gets votes. People want to be told that everything's okay. Meanwhile, oil companies, they want to keep people relying on oil. They don't want to say, look, we're not going to have as much oil in the future. You should think about, finding something other than oil, something that we don't happen to have. They're preparing themselves to benefit from what they know is coming and grab more of the pie. Well, we saw this when the biggest Wall Street banks manipulated the United States government to gain trillions of dollars from the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Okay, if they're preparing, how can you prepare? What can you do so that you have a way to make a livelihood and you can take care of your family and you can have a career in the future? This is a big question, and nobody has all the answers. Successfully crash landing a civilization is not easy. It's not something we have a lot of experience at. But here's some tips and ideas to at least get you started in two areas: your psychology and your career. Psychological strategies. Firstly, you can expect these common reactions to major change. It's very normal when change is thrust upon us and unwelcome to experience denial. Oh no, it can't be true. Or anger, bargaining. Oh, if I'm just a good recycler, if I just drive a hybrid car, then everything will be okay. Fear, anxiety, and even depression are not that unusual when confronted with these types of challenges. And they actually can be part of a normal process that we have to go to reach a point of acceptance where we can then begin to take action on information which is new and challenging. The good news is that a book called The Myth of the Great Depression, found by a former historian, which was based on extensive research, found that the media image of the Great Depression in the 1930s overemphasized the subjective experience of suffering that people had at the time. And that actually many people, when interviewed later, said that actually we were poor, but we were still happy.